I'm really excited for today. We have two of our freight experts, Nick Smith and Nick Stachel. We'll start with you, Stachel. How'd you guys get started in logistics?
Yeah, so I started my logistics career as a intern for a transportation software company. The software was to connect commercial drivers like truck drivers with roadside conditions, mimicking the CB radio but putting it into your phone. After that, I moved into the 3PL freight broker world. I interned for a few freight brokers and then which led into a full-time position, moving into standard freight and then leading into a hazardous freight experience.
Hazardous, like uranium and crazy stuff like that.
All over the place, really. So I did it mostly during COVID, which was all hand sanitizers, cleaning supplies, going to hospitals. So it was really cool going into work because you knew that you're moving some really cool freight around that was really helping people out.
Cool. All right, Nick Smith, what about you?
Yeah, I started off at Kuehne+Nagel in 2019. Coming in, I really had no idea of supply chain. So I was like a finance guy back in college. Never really knew how things got to where they were on the store shelves, but I just fell into Kuehne+Nagel, and with my interest in like finance and like international relations and international business, it was like a great stepping stone for me to learn what supply chain is and what logistics is. So when I was there, I was working on the TPEB ISC trade lane, which is Trans-Pacific eastbound. So everything from Asia, India, Southeast Asia to the US, which is a massive trade lane. And I managed the Northeast region's pricing and allocation for that, ranging from Fortune 500 clients to small mom and pops. So it was a really great experience to learn the background of what gets everyone's goods moving at the end of the day.
One of the things I love about you guys is you actually have spent time on the other side, on the actual carrier side. What were some of the wildest logistics requests that you guys had?
Yeah, so for me, dealing with hazmat freight, a crazy request was delivering freight to a penitentiary. It was difficult because there were specific requirements, clearly additional paperwork. The driver needs to have a clear record, but the driver could also not wear blue. So not only are you looking for drivers in the area that can deliver the freight, but you also have to ask, hey, do you have any wardrobe? Can you wear something that's not blue? And that was a pretty strange question for them to hear, but it was definitely a fun one. And then also we moved decommissioned guns from a police barracks in an inner city in the Northeast down to a firing range in Texas. A lot of requirements that the drivers needed to meet, which was one, navigating around an inner city, tight turns. So that's pretty standard, but also being able and comfortable with hauling guns across the country. So that was definitely something fun to move around.
Why were we sending hazardous stuff to inmates?
Cleaning supplies.
Well, this logistic request on my side were RoRo requests, which for those that don't know, it's roll on, roll off ocean ships. So basically, like instead of putting it in a container, you're just rolling it onto the ship. So it can be anything from cars to, in my case, like cell phone towers and manufacturing equipment. So that was always a fun exercise, I guess you can say, when it comes down to pricing, because you need the length, the weight, all these different aspects, and working with the origin office to try to figure out exactly what this thing looks like actually on the ship and where it can fit. Outside of that, I had similar experiences, Nick, with U.S. government contracts. So everything needs to go on a U.S. flag ship, which really is only a few carriers, mainly Matson, that offers that. And then on top of that, obviously, you had to have a clear driver to make the final delivery and so forth into these military bases.
Nick, I want to stick with you for a second. Talk to us about air freight. I know that it goes in a plane, it goes underneath it, but what are all the nuances for how that happens? Who's the freight forwarder actually working with? And what impacts their ability to make money?
Yeah. So like mostly for air freight, how it starts off is typical for like most shipments. Obviously, a client would reach out, request pricing, giving the volume, the size, the dims, the weights of the cargo. And the freight forwarder would then take that and go to their origin office, which typically has pricing for this that works directly with the carriers or the air carriers at origin. With that information, they'll figure out exactly what the pricing would look like, what this would fit in, whether it be a pallet that would go onto a cargo plane or if it would fit in a UID, which is basically a ULD, which is a unit load device, similar to what you like in an airport, carrying small parcel or loose packages. Once they figure that out, obviously it goes back to the client. If they accept pricing, then the booking starts. Either the supplier will deliver it to a CFS location, which is a consolidation location, that's handled by the freight forwarder or one of the partners of the freight forwarder. They will then load it onto the plane. Depending on how or what the routing is, either there'll be a few stops along the flight or it'll be transferred to other flights throughout its journey, or it goes directly to the port or the airport that it's destined to go into From there, it would go through customs and then be handled in a facility until it gets picked up for an LTL driver to deliver to the final location. And typically, how the freight forwarders make money here is the delta of the contracts. So if the air freight carrier is pricing something at $3.50 per kilo, the freight forwarder will take that contract, add their own margin on top of it, and then sell it to the end brand or buyer to negotiate that.
Digging in there, do freight forwarders typically have specific airlines or specific lanes that they're really competitive with and others that they're not competitive with?
Yeah, it depends on what the partnerships are set in stage. So obviously it's similar to the ocean space where there are like MQCs for specific rates. So if the freight forwarder is on a larger scale, they're able to promise a larger amount of volume to the air carrier. But at the end of the day, the air carrier rates, they change more frequently. It's a daily rate at the end of the day based on demand.
A daily rate, more than just checking Google Flights. It's like, what impacts that daily rate?
What impacts the rates that it's going through? Yeah, it's based on obviously like where the demand is at, what's the current status of the market, what's the current prices going on for similar routings in that aspect.
I had a question. I jump in here. So if we're moving freight on a passenger jet or anything like that, does the amount of passengers really affect the ability to move cargo on that plane specifically?
Personally, I don't have a full background on exactly how it would work out, but I know for a fact that obviously like United, Delta, and so forth, like they utilize space on those flights.
Am I ever bumped from a flight because someone is paying for the storage underneath? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. That's why they tell you have to check your bag.
Yeah, that's too funny. Flipping over to domestic transports or over the road, Nick, talk to me about how freight brokers make money and what are the nuances with their business model between LTL and FTL?
Yeah, similar to what Nick was just mentioning, freight brokers make money based on a margin of the actual cost, which is PTE, purchase transportation expense. You can either charge a customer based on one of two ways. So one is a flat rate. So let's just say a customer needs to move some cargo around and the freight broker says, all right, we'll move it for $1,000. They quote it out. Okay, great. The freight broker will then post the shipment on a job board or a load board or reach out to their network of carriers and say, hey, I have this shipment here. What would you like to move it for? And ideally around, depending on the market, depending on the time, they might start with around $800 in that total $1,000. So they have $200 of a wiggle room. Negotiate around and hopefully trying to make it around 10 to 15% of a margin, which is good. Or they can utilize a cost plus model. So that's essentially saying the freight broker, the first thing that they'll do is book the carrier and then they'll add in a margin on top. There are pros and cons to each. The pro to the flat rate is that the customer doesn't really get burnt. The customer knows what they're going to get charged, but the freight broker can get burnt at the end of the day. Maybe they lose a little bit of money. Maybe they don't make a solid margin on it. So it's a little bit volatile on that end. But the cost plus, it's really saying a customer saying, hey, I need this cargo moved, book it, find a carrier, book the truck. I'll pay whatever, pay yourself 6, 8, 10%. And then let's just get on. I just need this freight moved at the end of the day.
How often would you find it that brokers were losing money?
It really depends on the market conditions. When I used to be a broker, we would have big annual contracts with Fortune 500 companies. So they'd run a freight RFP once a year and you were locked into those rates. And so we ran one at the end of 2019 going into 2020 and everything was fine until COVID hit. And coming out of LA, that's when capacity started to go insane. So look at the domestic transportation market like an Uber or a Lyft when you're thinking of surge pricing, but take that to a greater level as regions, not just the city. Consider all the cargo that was coming into the LA ports during COVID. It really started to hit at around May into for the next 18 to 24 months, that there was a ton of cargo being inbounded into that region, but the supply of drivers weren't there. So drivers really wanted to get into the California area. So you can pay a driver almost next to nothing if you had a shipment going into California because they knew they were going to make it back and then some coming out. Sometimes when we were getting burned and we had to go back to our customers with our tails between our legs saying, hey, we quoted so many lanes of this volume at XYZ, but we are paying so much more and losing 50, 100% on these loads because we want to fulfill our obligations with you, but just the market and unforeseen circumstances are dictating how much we're losing.
Would you find that when big companies were negotiating annual contracts that the margin that you were taking was higher or lower than what you would try to do in the spot market?
It was actually lower. So we were actually extremely competitive because we want the volume. So at the end of the day, they want to show the volume and the revenue. And if you're having a big time brand say, hey, we have 10,000 shipments a year, you're going to try to win all those 10,000. Clearly, they're not going to give them all to you, but you're going to be as competitive as possible to win the most. But when you're dealing with a smaller base brand, that's really where you can make a little bit more margin because, you're not going to have the volume. You're not going to see 100 shipments a month. It's going to be a little bit lower. So you can squeak in a few more percentage points of margin.
Cool. Nick, let's talk about ocean freight. Is there any nuances with ocean freight that you saw?
So ocean freight, obviously, there's two options at the end of the day, the LCL and FCL options. So LCL is consolidated. So basically, if you have typically like under 5 to 6 pallets, it's probably primary for you to go this route. Otherwise, you move to a 20-foot FCL container. So FCL containers come in 3 different sizes, 2 of which are nearly the same. So you got 20-foot, 40-foot, and 40-foot high cube. Obviously, there's also specialty stuff that we don't really want to get too far into because that's more for manufacturing or larger orders, larger pieces of cargo. So the process is similar, as I said, with the air freight. So obviously, origin client reaches out. We look at the pricing. Typically, when we worked at KN, we had the pricing on our side, so we were able to actually live quote what the shipping rates were. If there was origin pieces, meaning they had to get picked up or so forth, we would have to reach out to our origin contact to get everything aligned. So typically, if you're requesting something, it's going to take 24 hours to get a response back. It's not going to be something instantaneous for most of these freight forwarders. So once everything gets booked, obviously with the FCL container, the empty container will come into the supplier, or the supplier will pick it up and bring it to themselves to load it up. LCL, either you get it picked up, the loose pallets, or the supplier delivered to CFS. Once everything's filled, if it's LCL, it's getting consolidated with other goods. If it's FCL, container stuffed, gets brought into the port, gets in-gated for the sailing that you guys booked on. So there's multiple different sailings, a lot of different options. It's a big map at the end of the day for different opportunities, whether you're on the client side, you want to play around with the shipping times or different options on pricing. And the same thing for a freight forwarder, gives a lot of different options to get the freight out. Similar to air freight comes into the U.S., runs through customs, then final delivery, depending on whether it's getting delivered locally, where it's going into a ramp. So we'd have to get it railed in over to Chicago or Indianapolis, and then it gets picked up and final delivery on that end. The biggest piece here is like where the freight forwarder is going to make their money. There's 2 different options, and it depends on purely on your volume, your consistency for a buyer. If you're a small buyer, typically you're looking at the FAK rates, what the spot market is. Back during COVID, we saw those prices go up to $25,000 per container. We were paying $2,500 in the same spot just a year prior. So the spot market goes with what the demand is in the market. Then there's the fixed market.
Who sets that spot price? Is that the ocean carriers or is that the forwarders?
Yeah, so this is where the ocean carriers decide where they want to be at. There's these things called alliances. You see these alliances get created. 3 to 4 different ocean carriers would be together in an alliance. And it seems almost like a price fixing match. I used to have a board on my computer that could see how each alliance was quoting. And you can see who wanted the East Coast routings, who wanted the West Coast routings, and who wanted the inland routings. Because everyone else in that alliance would then either higher their price for inland if they wanted the one carrier to take the inland, or vice versa. The ocean carriers on the spot market is basically the live rates that the carriers are telling the freight forwarders. The freight forwarders then take those rates and then add whatever they want on top. Typically speaking, what we would do at Kunanaga was to cover 3 ocean carriers, just in case a few others drop through. So at least we had one option at all times. It adds more space for the freight forwarder to make money here, obviously. So if the top 3 range from $1,000 to $2,000 in price, we're taking the $2,000 price, adding money on top, and then we're pushing to book on the cheapest carrier at $1,000. So at the end of the day, we can make $1,500 on that one container. This became exorbitant during COVID in the spot because we were now talking about $25,000 containers, and the delta between the top 3 or 4 was anywhere between $5,000 to $10,000. So we were pushing at the highest point saying, hey, we need to cover 3 to 4 carriers because shipments are getting rolled left and right. We want to make sure we get you on the boat. But at the end of the day, we were telling our origin office, hey, let's push for the lowest carrier possible here and make up the money that we weren't making prior to COVID.
What was that spread between your destination and origin office typically?
So typically how it works out for most freight forwarders is they will tell their origin office how much they're selling for so they can do a profit share. So the origin office will take half of whatever the delta is on that shipment. It gives the origin office more drive to become more profitable because the fact that if they get the lower carrier, they can make up that money. But that's how the profit share is split. And given some freight forwarders use agents, it's the same exact thing. They advise what they sold it for, split the profit. But yeah, during COVID, there was a lot of money being moved around just because of the fact of how frantic the market was, and we didn't know what was going to get loaded and what was not. So we had to cover as many options as possible so we didn't have to go back to the buyer or the customer and say, hey, we need to requote this again because the rates are not aligned. We want to make sure that we're covering at least the top of the market so we can have all options on the table.
That's super interesting. The fact that you have these alliances, which sounds like a nice way to say cabal or cartel. And it's funny, if you look back at all of the price fixing and just lawsuits that have come out internationally over the last 50 years, a good portion of them have been through ocean carriers in particular. But you've got these groups here that are really just focused on carving up the country, carving up the market. And the fact that you as a forwarder are looking at and not necessarily getting the benefit of the lowest carrier as a brand is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting time to be at a freight forward from 2019 to 2021. And it's the same example as Nick said before, but there was a lot of unanswered questions going around of where the market was going and where we had space to get these containers loaded. And we had ocean carriers selling premium service, right? So at the time you could move with MSC and the container would cost you $20,000. But for an added 10% to 20%, you could guarantee that it wouldn't be rolled. So they were selling these premium services to guarantee that they wouldn't be rolled. But then when the boat didn't show up or they skipped the port, which can happen, you didn't get rolled. The boat just missed the port. So you paid that extra 10, 20%. Your shipment didn't move. It didn't get rolled, but the boat just didn't arrive to port because it was either overloaded or they were trying to create artificial space.
So in other words, you paid your protection money, but then the thugs took the weekend off and you still got robbed.
Exactly.
Cool. Whether it's air freight or ocean or domestic, how much volume do you actually need to negotiate? If I'm a brand and I'm going to a freight forwarder, I'm going to a broker, and I have 10 trucks or 100 trucks or 1,000 trucks, what makes it interesting for a broker?
Yeah, I definitely think the higher the volume, the more leverage that you have to negotiate. Sure. Clearly, you don't have a lot of leverage if you have 1 to 5 shipments a month. But at the end of the day, you want to see your logistics provider as more of a partner. So it's not a you and I, it's more of a we. How can we deliver our cargo to XYZ as quick as possible, as efficient as possible? There's a time and a place to go back and negotiate a specific spot quote or a contract rate. So if you're doing contract rates or an RFP, clearly you're going to have a few rounds to negotiate it down, but then you're going to need proposed volumes and timelines and et cetera. So it can get a little bit more into the weeds. But if you're going to go on the spot-based approach where every single shipment you're going to ask a quote, you don't want to be that brand that says, oh, can you get down a little bit lower? Because that's just going to be harder on the broker. And the broker is not going to want to work with you because they're just going to say, I'm going to give this brand $1,000 and then they're just going to negotiate me down. So what they could do is if they really want $1,000, they're just going to quote you at $1,200 and then they're just going to agree on the $1,000 because it's not like you have the analytics, the DAT analytics to determine, okay, this is really going for 800. You're quoting me at 1,200. Let's meet at 1,000. So really identifying the volume that you have, maybe around 50 to 100 trucks a month, you have good leverage to work with that provider. But again, at the end of the day, you don't want to be that person negotiating every single spot rate, every single LTL rate, because they still have to make money. They're providing the service. They're working with the carriers directly. And so they have to get paid at the end of the day. And you're really not allowing them to make as much money as they want at the end of the day.
Yeah. And just doing the math there, in your example, if the broker is making $200 off the spread of that truck, it sounds like they need to be making $10,000 to $20,000 a month in profit for them to sit up and be interested. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So on the international side, given that the spread is typically much higher, we talked about people making in normal times $1,500 on a shipment, and in COVID times making a lot more. Is the threshold for having enough volume to negotiate, is that much lower than the 50 to 100 that we're looking at the domestic?
Okay, so just to go back and re-explain like what it was like pre-COVID on profitability for these containers, we're talking about $150.
Oh, really?
That was our flat piece that we were looking at. And given we could make a few extra bucks left here and there, but it wasn't as massive as what we were seeing during COVID. Now, when it comes down to obviously the negotiations, we're back in this period where ocean rates are $1,500 to the West Coast. So we're back to pre-COVID times. There's not that much room for negotiations. It's similar to the domestic market where you're talking about a few $100s in savings, maybe $100 here, $150 here. But for the most part, we're been like a race to the bottom as the market softens. When it comes down to, there's another option of being on a fixed contract with your freight forwarder. And those negotiations normally take place in around Q1 to Q2, where the contracts are being signed between the freight forwarder and the ocean carriers, where they'll actually put in a client specifically onto the contract and lock them into a rate with a floating bunker. Bunker is like the fuel. Obviously, they don't want to eat the fuel costs. In that case, if you're moving about 2 to 3 containers a week, you can probably set up an agreement with your freight forwarder to lock in the rates. So when we're looking back a year ago, where rates were still around $15,000, there were situations where people actually were locking in those rates because of their worry that we were going to go back into $25,000. And what that caused a situation was these contracts actually were for 1, 2, and 3 years of locking in rates of $10,000 because you're like, oh, I'm going to save $5,000 a container. Those contracts actually had like clauses within them advising that if they missed a shipment on a week, they would have to pay 50% of what the container cost was on the contract. So you'd be $5,000 out, even if you missed a shipment or you decided to go with the FAK or spot rate market at the time. So it was basically a robbery by the ocean carriers because ocean carriers made these contracts. Freight forwarders didn't make these contracts. Freight forwarders advised a majority of their clients to stay away from these contracts, even though that there were some cases where they were signed because of the fact that the client wanted them so bad because they were worried about where the market was going.
And so what you're saying is there could be some brands today, some big brands that are still paying $10,000, $15,000 a container because that's what the contract says, even though we are 2 years away from the peak.
If they haven't been able to renegotiate that contract and buy themselves out of that contract, then there could be a possibility there are still some people that are signed to those contracts.
Wow, that's amazing. When you guys were on the brokerage side, was there ever a tendency to improve the margin for the broker if, or a lack of term, to take advantage of someone who wasn't super sophisticated, clearly didn't know what they were doing? Did you ever see that playing out?
Yeah, so I saw it as a broker and as a brand as well. So as a broker, I've seen my fellow colleagues charge additional margin on accessorials. So an accessorial like a truck order not used, a TONU, or a layover. And that's just strictly should be a pass-through charge. Industry standard TONU should be about $200, $250, and that should just be passed right to the customer. But some of the brokers will say, okay, that was a $400 TONU. And the customer will be like, okay, I'll pay it. So that's really where the brokers can take advantage. And on the brand side, one of the clients I was working on, I just dove into a mid-project that they were working on. They were doing about 61 truckloads, 600-mile runs, 61 truckloads in about a month. And I started looking at the invoices, and they're being charged $6 a mile, which is astronomical. And standard freight, it's a good lane going to from city to city. And after reaching out to the broker, requesting an explanation on these $6 per mile lanes and shipments, they just didn't have an explanation and they were cut immediately. Brokers definitely like to have a customer that doesn't know what they're doing. And as a brand that you don't really have an idea, try to look up some easy lingo to show that you have an understanding of the market and an understanding of what's going on so that they're less likely to take advantage of that.
That's remarkable. $6 a mile, what should it be?
Standard freight, when I was a broker, standard freight was about $1.50.
Gosh.
Yeah. $2 a mile to the customer is pretty understandable. Again, it was a standard lane. You're not going to Wyoming. You're going to a good market. And at the end of the day, it's really where you're going and also where you're picking up from. You want to ensure that you have a big pool of drivers where you're picking up from. But it was a good origin, a good destination. We found another broker that was 55% cheaper. So wow. They were charging about $3,600. We found another broker that was charging $17,000, and we cut them immediately.
Yeah, I can see why. What are some of the tells that a broker may have to recognize that they're working with somebody who's unsophisticated?
Immediately improving invoices. So when you're a brand, and we had this one brand that was exploding in growth. They just simply didn't have the time or bandwidth to go through invoices with hundreds of shipments to vet them out, saying what was quoted, are we being invoiced what we were quoted. Brokers can sometimes assume that as a blank check. So they're not going to really look into the invoices. We're just going to be submitting anything that we can submit, and kind of fingers crossed we're going to have a high chance of getting what we want.
Wow, that's remarkable. What are some of the things that would tip off a broker that, hey, this person knows what they're talking about? Is it the way that they present, how they're introduced, lingo, or things that they say?
Yeah, so it's definitely lingo. It's definitely understanding, okay, first, how I approach any broker is I was a former freight broker myself. So it sets the tone of I know what I'm doing here. Again, what I said previously is working together. So it's more of a partnership. Some brands that, aren't really familiar with the lingo or logistics, they can view logistics as an issue happens. It's all the freight broker's fault. So it's all you, fix it. It's your fault. I'm not working with you anymore. But as a former freight broker, a majority of the time it's the carrier. The carrier broke down, which means I can't pick it up today. I'm not the one driving the truck. I'm just the messenger here, which is another thing. And really taking the emotion out of the relationship. You want to allow the broker to tell you bad news without keeping it from you so you can adjust accordingly. And so if you say, hey, I'm familiar with the industry, please don't be afraid to let me know if your driver had a blowout or missed the pickup or anything like that. I need to know ahead of time so I can adjust. And having a very normal, rational relationship with the brokers will really vet a positive outcome for all.
Wow. Yeah, I keep going back to that 75% markup that broker had with one of your clients. What's the most egregious ripoff that you guys have witnessed or heard about?
That was definitely up there. And that's what we try to do with our clients here. We try to come in as this level of expertise so that the client doesn't have to know where the market's at, where the market's going, or how to just read a quote. And sometimes clients will just say, great, first quote, I'll take it because I just want to get this freight moving. But again, if the broker considers you as a blank check, they're just going to take full advantage of you charging $6 a mile. It's more of a you against me, not, hey, how can we support to lower freight costs? How can we put your freight on the rail? Have you considered that? And that's really where the partnership lies. And it's not a you against me. It's more of a how can we do this together? Because at the end of the day, as soon as I found out that they were overcharging, we cut their volume. So we cut all their FTL volume, and then in 6 months, they're out completely. LTL, FTL, everything.
Yeah. Nick, I imagine on the air and ocean side, I felt like 2020, 2021 was just the year of the ripoff. But what was the worst thing that you'd heard or witnessed?
So the worst stuff that I've seen while working on the client side here is just the deltas in the quotes. So this is why we always recommend to clients to always have multiple freight forwarders, because obviously they're not all going to be on the same page that you're a blank check. So you'll be able to see who's looking at you as a blank check and who's not looking at you as a blank check. I know for a few clients, I've seen $10,000 to $20,000 in difference between two quotes, which is massive, just based on a similar service, similar level of operation. They're the same amount of containers, same amount of volume, but $20,000 in difference doesn't make any sense. So it's obvious that at that point, they were still looking at the market as open game. And obviously we decided to move forward with the cheaper option where we actually could tell that they were following the market based on different aspects that we could see and provide them with the shipment. And at the end of the day, push out that other freight forwarder that we saw that was trying to just take advantage of the client at the end of the day.
Yeah, I remember one, this was before COVID, but I had two quotes from a freight forwarder and I had done my research on the lane that they were going on. So there was really only one vessel that was going. It was a bit of a unique leg. And so there was only one carrier doing it, one vessel, and there was a $5,000 difference between the quotes for the two forwarders. And something here doesn't add up, guys. What are you doing?
Yeah, at the end of the day, like smaller forwarders will definitely have a higher cost from the ocean carrier just based on the pure volume that they're getting in and the relationship that they have with the actual ocean carrier. But something as egregious as $5,000 does not make up for that difference.
It was big enough to get lodged in my mind. What else do you look for beyond cost when you're selecting a carrier? How do you know if you have a good one or not?
Yeah, at the end of the day with freight forwarding, specifically with ocean freight for me, it's their understanding of what the carriers are, what the carrier offers are, what service strings there are. Obviously, when you're talking about major ports, there's a lot of different options on the table. And to make sure they're on the same page and understand what the difference is between ZIM and MSC on this routing, or that, CL only offers service that's transloaded through Shanghai, while maybe APL or Matson has a direct service line here, just for example. Having a forwarder that's willing to look into what the service strings are and what's actually available in that market and have access to multiple carriers and not just be quoting the same exact carrier over and over to you is a big difference. And it shows that they're working with you to help you find the best option. Not only that, but also them focusing on offering multiple different options for you. So going East Coast, West Coast to show you like it's going to take an extra 15 days to get in, but you're going to be saving 10% here if the cargo is not hot and you don't need it by next date.
Yeah, for me, I think this can also flow into international, but it's the reliancy on software. So nowadays, a lot of freight providers, logistics providers will say, hey, look at our fancy new dashboard. You can look exactly where the cargo's out. You have a little chat portal and everything, but their reliance on the portal can also often decrease their communication. And so we've seen time and time again where these big time logistics providers won't give us updates, and they'll provide an update on the portal without sending you an email. So you're saying, hey, where's this container at? Where's my cargo at? Where's the truck at? And at the end of the day, they sent you a notification 2 days ago on a portal and you just didn't think to check it. And so also, I really try to look at freight brokers that have a poor portal or even no portal at all, because they're the ones that will give you email updates every single day. They're the ones that are more proactive rather than reactive. And that's really what you want.
In other words, you're saying you can have low cost, good technology, or responsiveness. Pick two.
Yeah, pretty much. It's really at the end of the day what you want and what's important to you. And another thing to look out for is double brokering in the domestic market. So double brokering essentially means you book a shipment with broker number one. Probably you might have negotiated them down. You got them for a really low rate. And then broker one doesn't have any capacity. They don't know any trucks in the area to support that. They're going to broker that out to another broker who's going to find trucks. And so that is a huge no-no in the freight industry. It happens a lot, unfortunately, where it's just a communication delay at the end of the day. So you don't know who's picking up your freight. You don't know if you have an issue with the warehouse that you need to let the driver know immediately. It has to go to broker one, broker two, then the driver, which is just not a good scenario. So it's really vetting your broker, making sure that you're aligned on the same page. You have the same cautions, any issues in the past with previous logistics providers that you want to make aware of, just so that everyone's on the same page.
That's great. So if I'm a brand, right, and maybe I'm not doing that 50 to 100 shipments a month that we talked about to really have some leverage for negotiating, what are some innovative ways or ideas that you guys have seen that help take cost out for both carriers and for the brands?
Yeah, so for me, it's utilizing different modes of transportation and also having multiple brokers as well. So what I recommend is having a big time broker, have one of the brokers that everyone knows around the industry, and then also have a smaller based broker if you're a smaller brand, a broker that's scrappy, that's willing to compete against that other broker just to win that business, the one that's going to communicate with you every single day. Hey, how you doing? That knows you by name, knows your family members or something like that, that you're not just a number, but also utilize the bigger broker for their capabilities, intermodal capabilities, transloading capabilities, warehousing capabilities. So it's understanding a mix of both and having a diverse network and relationships across the board.
Yeah, for the international side, for brands to be better in cost savings here, it's again having multiple options on the table when it comes down to freight forwarders. Obviously, having a good standing relationship with one is massive, but at least always having someone to just piggyback off of to check if we're in the same market of rates. If you're able to get those two quotes and have a better understanding of what's going on, obviously you can negotiate back and forth to use that in your advantage.
Yeah, some of the stuff I've seen too with startups in particular is just planning out your loads together. And if I have something that's going from Chicago to New York and you have something going from New York to Chicago, being able to band together and almost buy to some extent. I'm not necessarily saying, hey, I'm going to order this truck, but being able to let the broker know that, hey, we're going to both come to you and try to sort that out is an interesting angle. If you've got a little bit more flexibility, milk runs, this idea that rather than going from point A to point B, you're going to go to point A, A1, A2, A3, A4 on the way to point B is also an interesting one. So I think at the end of the day, the brokers or the truck drivers need to keep their trucks full and moving. And anything you can do to help them do that is what's going to ultimately take cost out. A lot of times, like I'll find people who pick warehouses or factories that are in the middle of nowhere, and maybe they had a cheaper price because labor's cheaper or the infrastructure is cheaper, but you're going to give it back in the freight rates because there's brokers that don't want to drive 90 minutes out into the boonies to pick up a single load and then come back. So some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. So thinking about where you are with those transit lanes when you're designing your supply chain is a big impact that can influence the cost that you pay.
I also want to add in there, it's not also where, but when are you moving your
Yeah.
cargo? So there are some periods where when I was a freight broker, we had a good lane going from Pittsburgh to Chicago. And I know for a fact that now having a lane that would deliver to Chicago on a Monday, you have all the drivers based in Chicago calling you saying, hey, I'll take this load for next to nothing because I want to get home for the weekend. So it's where your freight is, but also when. When it's picking up, the day of the week, the day of the month type of thing to also consider.
Yeah, that reminds me when I was at Unilever managing freight, we always knew when vegetable season was because that seemed to wipe out all the capacity in certain parts of the country as they're getting produce out.
Yeah, absolutely. Southeast during the springtime is definitely a no-go when you're coming out of there.
For sure. Nick, you touched on this a little bit earlier when it came to intermodal and just mixing things up. What would you tell a brand who's trying to think about, should I send this via parcel, LTL, FTL, intermodal, etc.?
Yeah, so first thing you need to consider is looking at your brand and saying, okay, what is important to me? Is it cost, time, reliance, and identifying cost is an issue and I want things moved at a cheap cost, move it via LTL. If you have more than 8-ish pallets, move it via intermodal because it's really going to take more time, but it's really going to decrease the cost. If you have anything under a pallet, send it via parcel. But if you want to move things quick, even if you have under 8 pallets, but you need to get there tomorrow, move it via full truckload. So the difference in pricing is that for parcel, you're paying for that individual box, the weights, the dims, and it's similar to the LTL model where you're just paying for your space in that truck. So if you just have 3 pallets, they're going to load that truck up with other shippers to fill that truck, and you're just paying for your spot. And then for full truckload, you're paying for the whole truck. It doesn't matter if you put one single carton or 1 in 40 stacked pallets. It doesn't matter. It's just at the end of the day, you're paying for the whole truck and you're moving it. And then for intermodal, it's similar to the full truckload model, but you're really saving a lot of money. So for example, going from East Coast to West Coast, clearly a lot of containers need to be moved to the West Coast for cargo ships and transloading onto cargo ships. A good amount of containers are moving to the West Coast very cheap and almost empty. So if you can find a lane that you have going from, let's just say, the Northeast down to the West Coast, you can get it for half the cost, but it's just going to add 10 to 15 days in transit.
Interesting. But just as we're wrapping up, I'll give you a choice here. So either the weirdest shipment that you ever had to handle or one misconception that people think about the freight industry that you want to correct.
I can do both really quick. Not the weirdest, but the most fun was fireworks. Clearly hazardous, gearing up for the 4th of July, hauling fireworks, just getting fun and getting festive in that. And then a misconception is really just people often think that logistics is very simple. At the end of the day, on paper, it's very simple. But if you really want to optimize your network, make it as efficient and cost efficient as possible, it's really complex. Really getting to know and understanding how an RFP runs, a network of providers, where your cargo is moving, when you should be moving, as we've discussed previously. That's really what's bringing the complexity in your network.
For my side, weirdest shipment, I don't think I have one off the top of my head, but I think the biggest misconception is that it's like scary to learn logistics, I feel like, in some brands' minds. And as we discussed before, just knowing a little bit more about how ocean freight works or how air freight works or how domestic works. It's not a lot to go through and even use ChatGPT to give you a lesson plan. But the more you know about it, the more you're going to save and the more you're going to be able to build out your operations and make it a cleaner process for not only you, but for everyone on your team.
That's great. I'll give you my weirdest shipment. When I was running international for Unilever, we had one shipment come across our desk where we needed to move human skin. And so the R&D was a team in Connecticut had some new deodorant they wanted to try out. And there was like some ethnicity, I think in Southeast Asia, that they wanted to test the skin on. And we were trying to figure out what's the HTS code for a body part. And it was crazy. And what we ended up doing is saying, hey, rather than sending the skin to the US, why don't you send the deodorant to, I think it was Indonesia. And that worked out pretty well. But yeah, there's some crazy stuff that happens with big companies. I think the big misconception that I would want to correct is I think people think that truck drivers or people who work in the logistics industry are not smart. They're blue collar for a reason. The reality, these are some of the smartest people that I've ever met. The ability to not only understand what needs to be done and to do it day in and day out, and to know their equipment, to know the processes, to know how they're going to be consistent and relied upon is enormous. In logistics, if you're perfect, nobody says anything. right? That's the thing. You only hear about the things that don't go well. You only hear about the horror stories, but it is a special type of person who can be perfect and be okay not being celebrated for it. Nick, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much. I've certainly learned a lot, and we'll do it again next time.
Great. It was nice chatting.